have a new period that we're starting this time, and it is the Iron II period. So you have a new question set, which we will be working towards over the course of the next 5 lectures. I have given you a handy crib sheet similar to the one that you filled out in the discussion day the other day. And this is not a requirement for you to fill out. It's simply something that may help you as you are trolling through the long and complicated readings that are assigned for this time to help you organize the information. And that, in turn, will help you answer the questions on the question set. Questions 1 through 4 require you to consider evidence from Israel, which is to say the northern kingdom. We haven't gotten to the northern kingdom yet, but we soon will. It's the whole northern half of the country, excepting the coast, which is Phoenicia. The northern kingdom, Israel, the southern kingdom, Judah, and the area of Philistia, which is not a kingdom, but a set of cities that are linked by culture, by language, and by material finds as well as topography. The 5th question, the one about national identity, you are released from having to consider only Israel, Judah, and Philistia. You may choose peoples in those areas to answer that question, but you don't have to. There's lots of information about the emerging polities and identities in Transjordan, Moab, Edom, and Ammon. So the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites, and they too have archaeological information that's pertinent to that question, and you'll find information about that in Larry Herr's reading. So questions 1 through 4, the first, you have to pick something from Israel, Judah, and Philistia for each of them. Question 5, you can move about topographically. Are there immediate questions on the question set? No? Okay. Woo! Well, that's nice. Is that okay? You guys are right here in the front? Enough ambient light? In the Iron I period, we talked about the archaeology of this small region without really any consideration for biblical evidence / explanation / fables about what had happened. You can take your pick of those 3. We looked at the evidence on its own, and on its own, the evidence allowed us to identify 3 distinct groups of people who were either already residing or moved into this territory. We talked about that. I deliberately did not begin with injecting any ideas about the biblical texts, in part because it's an archaeology class and I wanted to start with material culture, in part because the biblical texts focus solely on one of those peoples, but there's such a disproportionate amount of archaeological evidence for everybody else that it would have, I feared, skewed the way you took in the data and amalgamated it. And in part because in the Iron I period, there could not have been any attempt at that time by anybody living in that area to actually record in a written document the information which has come down to us in the biblical text. And the reason is that the biblical text is a written text. It's not an oral text. We have oral texts from antiquity, most famously the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They embody literary devices or semantic devices that make it clear that those devices were in part meant to allow a singer to remember, just from his own memory, what was being said so that the story could be told. Eventually, those texts were written down, but originally they were oral. The Hebrew Bible is not like that. The Hebrew Bible, with the exception of a few small sections of poetry, especially in the books of Joshua and Judges, and like the Song of Deborah, for example, were originally written texts. So even the parts of the Hebrew Bible that purport to describe events in the period that we call Iron I could not have been written in that period because there was no way to write them. The technology wasn't there because there was not widespread evidence. There's no evidence for widespread literacy. The alphabet was just getting started. It was very crude, and it would not have been possible for these things to be documented. So anything that we have written down that discusses the period that we call Iron I has to be at least a couple hundred years later than the events describing. To give you some reality piece to compare that to, it would be as if now we decided to write about the Revolutionary War based on what we say about it. What stories you remember, what songs, and we could write a history. We might remember specific important places, the Boston Tea Party, Valley Forge, but they would be embedded in stories that will have been handed down through many, many generations. And while some elements might be the same, it would be difficult to call that clear, objective, historical narrative. The period that we're about to study now, the Iron II period, the 10th through the 7th centuries BCE, is different. And it is this period par excellence that promotes and privileges this tiny little area of the world to something that perhaps has drawn some or most of you into thinking this would be an interesting course to take, the archaeology of Israel. Because, of course, there's material remains and all kinds of archaeological work done not only throughout the world, but most especially throughout this section of the world, the Eastern Mediterranean, Italy, and Greece, and Anatolia, and Egypt. All of these have monumental, fascinating, interesting remains. But this tiny little area has something that none of the rest of them have, and that is a text that purports to be a historical record of what happened. And so, unlike in Iron I, where we did not really discuss too much what the biblical narrative had to say, here I want to start by having a small game of catch-up and review quickly, essentially, what is at stake when we look at the archaeology of Iron II. Because even if you don't know anything about the Bible, and even if you don't care anything about the Bible, and both of those are wholly legitimate stances, you cannot study this period. You cannot read what anybody else writes about this period. You cannot engage with the questions that have animated the people who have explored this period without knowing what was at stake for them, because that is what controls the kind of, the direction of exploration archaeologically that has gone on. So the big questions are these. Who are the Israelites? When do they first show up in the historical record? How do they settle into the land? What is the character of their society? And, of course, the biggie, then what happens? we have already answered the first 4 of these questions. Who are the Israelites and when do they first show up in the historical record? They first show up in the historical record in the time of the Pharaoh Merneptah in the latter part of the 13th century. There is already, by that time, some group of people that the Egyptians recognize as separate from the folks who live in the large Canaanite cities, and that separate group of people are called Israel. So they are not an urbanized folk, according to the hieroglyphics, which do not show in the denominative for Israel any evidence of a settled city. You don't have the little hieroglyph for a fortified city. Instead, you have the hieroglyph for a people, a man and a woman, and the throw stick indicates that these are a people against whom the Egyptians will come. So they are a folk that first show up in the late 13th century. How do they settle into their land? This we also know from archaeological evidence. They move in to an essentially unsettled area, so they don't really have to do any fighting to move in to that area. All of the zones of the Central Hills, the area here, Judea, the territories of biblical tribes of Judah and Benjamin, the area of Samaria, the northern hills, those are the biblical tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. The Jordan River Valley and Transjordan, which is dotless on this map, sadly, experienced this enormous influx of settlement. What is the character of their society? That, too, we have seen. It is small settlements, unfortified. The lifestyle is very basic. It's very poor. The cult areas are open air. They are not embedded in the society. This is a society that is learning to be literate. And literacy encodes, uses the alphabet, which had already been developed in the larger region of Canaan towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age, starting around the 16th or 15th century BCE. And then, of course, we want to know what happens next. We have a record of what happens next in the biblical books of 2 Samuel and 1 Kings. And in essence, Israel was organized into tribal units, 12 of them. And there was a leader of the tribal units, and his name was Saul. He was called by the tribes a king. But even when Saul was king, according to the text, a young man named David was the military mastermind, strategist, and leader of the tribes. And David is the person to whom, in the biblical account, tribal elders come and ask to rule them. David was 30 years old, says 2 Samuel, when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. He reigned in Hebron 7 years and 6 months, kind of precise. And in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. Oh, I forgot that was coming in there. Then we know from the biblical account that when David was old, he told his cadre of advisors, Zadok and Natan and Benaiah, to take his son Solomon down to Gihon, which is a spring near Jerusalem, and anoint him as the legitimate successor of David. Solomon, according to the text of 1 Kings, made an alliance with the Egyptian Pharaoh, married the daughter of the Pharaoh, brought his new wife to the city of Jerusalem, which David had captured and then made his capital, built a palace, built a temple, built a wall, a palace, a temple, and a wall fortified the city. Although the author of 1 Kings records here with some disapproval, people were still sacrificing at the high places. And it's pretty easy to imagine immediately what a real world analog to those words. Think about Mount Ebal. Think about the bull site. Those are certainly high places. They're up on the tops of mountains, the highest mountains in those zones. They were cult places. The people were still sacrificing at high places because a temple had not yet been built. And the text goes on to explain that in the reign of Solomon, after he had built these structures, his palace and the temple, he conscripted labor to build also Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. 1 Kings 9:15. Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had an astonishing number, 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. That's a wonderful, wonderful metaphor. And cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Like his father, Solomon reigned for 40 years. Then he was buried in the city of David, his father. His son Rehoboam succeeded him as king. And in the 5th year of Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. So says the biblical account. So, according to this account, by the time of Solomon's death and the accession of his son Rehoboam, the territory of these kings extended as far north as Damascus, as far south as the Red Sea, with the exception of a tiny little problematic area of the southern coastal plain and the interior Shephelah, the area that we know as Philistia. This monarchy, we call the United Monarchy in historical terms, controlled this huge territory from Tifsah to Gaza, from Dan to Beersheba. Dan up here in the far north, Beersheba down here in the far south. In the 5th year of Rehoboam, this king Shishak attacks Israel, according to 1 Kings and according to the recapitulation of 1 Kings in the book of Chronicles, which was written a long time after. Happily for us, this Shishak left a pictorial and hieroglyphic record of this same foray into Israel. On the wall of the Temple of Amun at Karnak. These structures at Karnak, we keep going back to Karnak, and you must be starting to wonder, unless you've already studied Egyptian art and archaeology, what is the deal here? The Temple of Amun at Karnak was an enormous set of structures that was continually added onto by subsequent pharaohs. It was a hieroglyphic and pictorial record of the mighty feats of the New Kingdom pharaohs over hundreds of years, a standing account of their various victorious campaigns and conquests. And there is an uncanny repetition to the images and to some of the conquests from pharaoh to pharaoh. So uncanny that it is not always completely clear if a pharaoh actually did what he said he did, or whether this is the ultimate in spin, the adoption of an earlier pharaoh's conquests by a later pharaoh for his own self-aggrandizement.
Do we have any records if the rules of the Israeli kings are actually 4 years, or they just saying people
The only account that we have of the length of the reigns of David and Solomon per se is in the Bible. We do not. We do not. But from a later historian, Josephus, who writes in the 1st century CE, so 1,000 years later, but who uses all sorts of records. Josephus tells us, he's interested in the exact question that you are. He writes a book called The Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus. We're going to be meeting him when we get to the Roman period. And he is interested in his accounting of whether or not this stuff can be true. And how can you link up the kings of Israel and Judah with other known historical personages to help substantiate this record. So Josephus tells us that in the 4th year of King Solomon was the same as the 12th year of another king, a king called Hiram, who ruled in Tyre. And Hiram of Tyre is known to us from recordings in Neo-Assyrian imperial annals, cuneiform annals from the Mesopotamian empire of Neo-Assyria. And he is linked with Assyrian kings, whose records continue down into pretty clearly documented historical times and hook up eventually with events in the Greek world, and then through Herodotus and the dating of things by Olympiads, get us down into historical times. So through this kind of, it's not exactly roundabout, but from one step here and then one step there, from the Olympiads in Greece to linkages with the Assyrian kings, to a linkage back to the Phoenician kings, to a linkage between the 12th year of Hiram of Tyre and the 4th year of Solomon. The 4th year of Solomon comes out to be in sometime in the decade of 960s, between 960 and 950. And if you accept that and you say, well, if that's the 4th year of Solomon and we go back 4 years and then we go back 40 years, we get David starting right around the extremely convenient for all students of archaeology classes evermore, year 1000. And if you then go forward from that and say David ruled for 40 years, that would take him down to about 960. Solomon ruled for 40 years, that would take him down to about 920. In the 4th year of his successor, Rehoboam, Shishak comes in. We know the date of Shishak because the Egyptian pharaohs also are dated by a long continuous series. Shishak is dated, his reign starts in 925. So these various clues actually all cohere, which strongly supports the amount of time given in the biblical text. 40 years for David and 40 years for Solomon, with David starting right around 1000. All right, so here is the portal of Shishak. It's called the Bubastite portal because Shishak was born in the small Egyptian town of Bubastis, and he made this portal that in part glorifies that. But in part what the portal does is record this colossal campaign of Shishak. And the way that it records the campaign is that in the hand of the god Ammon, standing here with his gigantic crown of Lower Egypt, he's got some reins in his hand. You can see that. And the reins are attached, each one, to one of these human figures whose body is a cartouche with the name of a town. And you see the hieroglyphic symbol in many cases for town, but not in every case. So here's one, for example, where it's not a town, but it's some smaller sort of settlement, and as it's now fortified. There are 156 of these name cartouches on the wall of the Bubastite portal at Karnak. And most of them seem to be names of places in Canaan. It's called Canaan by the pharaoh. Retinue is the Egyptian name for Canaan. Now, this ought to really cinch the deal. This is fantastic. Got it, a dated, colossal, destructive campaign by an Egyptian pharaoh. And this is basically good news. We can look for names of places that we can identify, and if we find a destruction level that is essentially the latter part of the 10th century, we can legitimately speculate that that is the destruction of Shishak. And what that does is allow us to say the level that is destroyed has to date to the time of David and Solomon, because that would be right down to the time of Shishak.
Just to clarify, the portal, was that part of the temple to Ammon?
Yes, it's one of these additional courts. This is what happens with the pharaohs. They just keep adding another court on. So if you go to Karnak, anybody here been to Karnak? You walk through. Do you remember walking through endless halls?
It's huge.
It's huge.
Huge.
That's right. First, of course, there's the great Sphinx-lined walkway, which is so cool. But then you go through hall after hall after hall, and these are the things that are called portals. And every hall has a big wall, and every wall has a bunch of reliefs showing a victorious pharaoh, either in a chariot or striding along, larger than life, smiting away, with many hieroglyphics explaining who they smote. So, all right. So, according to Shishak's 156 named cities, much of the area of Canaan is under attack by him. Few small problems. Problem number one, we can't really read the names of many of these cities. I mean, we can sound them out, but we don't know what they go with. We don't know what that name matches up with on the ground. There are a number that are definite. Megiddo is in the list. Gezer is in the list. Tanakh, Beersheba, Hebron. There are places that are recognizable, but out of the 156, there are a lot that are not. So many that we can't really be sure in what direction or order this campaign went, because if you can kind of mix and match names with places, then you can't, it's not anything like a clear geographic or topographic line of march. Tom?
Is there any evidence in Egypt?
No.
Palaces?
No. This of Shishak's campaign, any evidence in Egypt? No, the only...
He had all these different cities up here. Can you go by that?
Well, we don't know what a lot of these... We can read the letters, but we don't know what place they necessarily go with. Here is the problem. So a part of the portal wall is damaged, and you can see some of that damage right here, and there are other parts that are damaged. And that means that a lot of the cartouches are incomplete, and there probably are missing sections. As it happens, there are very few names in the area of Judah. Now, either Shishak doesn't march against Judah, or the Judah areas are not replicated clearly enough on the portal. Or there's actually a third possibility, And the third possibility is that there is a very strong similarity between the list of names Shishak advertises himself as having conquered and an earlier large conquest recorded on another portal wall at Karnak, that of Thutmosis III, which took place in the Late Bronze Age, who also campaigns sequentially and with great evidence of destruction and conquest in Canaan. So it's not even clear that Shishak did all that much campaigning and destroying. Nonetheless, with all, Carl, you have a question.
I just had along the line of question. They can decipher Tanakh and like Gaza, some of the larger areas in this relief here. Is there any order to those larger cities? Like for instance,
No
order at all. Because if they were placed in order of conquest, then that
right.
might have been-
Right. That's an excellent idea. Is there any order to at least the ones that are unequivocally identified? And the answer is, and that's why you get a map that looks like this. This map is complicated, and it's just one attempt to make some sense of these things. We don't even know, for example, they're not even in groups, clearly.
So all the arrows here are showing what they know from the relief?
Yes.
Those are all the cities?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The arrows on the map are based on identification of many of these name cartouches with cities.
If Shishak really didn't do this and he was just copying someone else, wouldn't there be in all of those names one that he would have written down saying conquered, but that didn't contain
I'm not actually saying that he didn't do this. There's evidence that he did. There's a which I'll get to. I don't mean to imply that it's completely false, but that doesn't. Embellished. Embellished is a strong possibility, and there's evidence that. And if Shishak did this, he would be in good company because there's evidence that many pharaohs did this. This was common. And you have to just think of the mentality of the pharaoh here. He's going to put this record of his conquests up on the wall of Karnak, and he is confronted with hundreds of years of his illustrious predecessors and their successful conquests, as recorded anyway on the walls of Karnak. So there is, one of the things that's kind of interesting about these is how nobody ever does worse than somebody who went before them. It's always an improvement upon an earlier performance. So this is the longest list of names by far in Shishak's conquest list, and some of them are certainly the case. The implications of what I was saying are really that, okay, there are two geographic areas that are especially well represented in the decipherable names in the conquest list, and one is down here in the Negev, and the other is up here in the Jezreel Valley and the northern part of Samaria. This territory, especially right through the Jezreel Valley, and this area are clearly under attack by Shishak, according to the list. So part of the question is, why not Judah and Jerusalem? According to the biblical text, the epicenter of power is Jerusalem. That's the most important city at this time. That's the city that David conquers, makes his capital. Solomon fortifies, builds his palace. Everything else is subsidiary to Jerusalem in the 10th century, according to the biblical text. And yet, Jerusalem and Judah are very much ignored in this list. So then you have to try to decide which is the reality behind this conquest. So what we want to do now is, with this bookend of the latter part of the 10th century, this possibility, try to answer this question based on the archaeology now, and not the biblical text. And we know what the biblical text says about what happened between around 1025 and 925. Saul was king, then David was king. He establishes the city of Jerusalem as his capital. He's succeeded by his son Solomon. Solomon builds a palace, fortifies the city, builds a temple, fortifies chariot cities, specifically Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And then, around 925, in the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, Shishak comes and levels much of the land. That's what happens in this century, this 100 years, according to the Bible. Archaeologically, in around 1025, we're here. Here's where we are around 1025, this map right here that's got a large territory of Philistine occupation, a now restricted area of Canaanite occupation, the Jezreel Valley and then actually going up the coast, and densely settled highland hill country, densely settled but with small, unfortified, few family hamlets. Let's go to Hazor. At Hazor, towards the very end of the late Bronze Age, the great city with its huge citadel and its even larger lower city, its magnificent citadel temple up here, its many, many temples and neighborhoods down here in the lower city, the folks here at Hazor, the Canaanites here at Hazor, were worried about an attack. How do we know? Because in the small temples in the lower city, the statues, such as this, were deliberately hidden. They were put in caches underground. So up here, the Canaanites at Hazor were worried about somebody coming to attack the city, and they were worried that the people who were coming to attack were people who were in strong disagreement with them, at least about religious ideas and practices. And they were right to be worried, because the city is attacked and destroyed comprehensively. And those statues that were hidden are dug up and deliberately mutilated. So here you see this seated statue as it was found by Yigal Yadin in his excavations of the lower city in the 1950s, beheaded. In area M, between the lower city and the upper city, the great basalt throne, the monolithic 2-ton platform, was burned in a fire so hard that it cracked and broke into over 1,000 pieces. And here it's been put back together. And that same fire completely devastated the Citadel Temple on the top of the mountain. The mud bricks fell in a huge conflagration and burned to a crisp. The basalt orthostats that covered the lower walls of the temple, like the throne down in area M, burned and fell down in pieces. Here they've been restored. In the area of the courtyard of the Citadel Temple, the only evidence after the burning and destruction for life are many pits that have been dug through the courtyard, and the pits were filled with broken pieces of pottery, grinding stones, ashes. So they look like garbage pits. This looks like some sort of squatter occupation. People are living, you can imagine, sort of huddled, campfires, and then they put their garbage in these pits, which they just dig through the floor of the courtyard of the Citadel Temple. But these folks aren't quite that unorganized. As we know from the remains, again in Area M, over the level of the esplanade with the throne platform, stratigraphically over it, and so putting it out of use, you see corner right there, is an enormous wall, a fortification wall that's built enclosing the citadel, cutting it off from the lower city, and fortifying the upper city. This wall is made out of mud brick on a stone socle, so you see the stones for the underpinning of the wall here. And at the lower levels, stones to give it a strong lower course and also protect it against the damp. That's what stones do, because mud brick deteriorates. And then you see the size of these mud bricks, large. The wall is huge. It's very broad, and now you're looking at a view of the top of the wall. So here's the side of it. There's those stones sticking out. And you can still see the individual mud bricks that were laid. So there's this enormous thick wall built surrounding the citadel. This is what fills in the Iron One period at Hazor, but the Iron One period lasts how long? How long is Iron One? 200 years, from around 1200 to around 1000. And yet this occupation, such as it is, at Hazor, does not represent life longer than about 50 years. And it is not possible to tell whether it is at the beginning, the middle, or the end of the Iron One period. It is not possible to tell whether these pits in this mud brick wall go with the people who destroyed the temples and mutilated the statues right away in around 1200, whether it goes with some peoples who then come in when this area is essentially abandoned for a while, but then leave again, or whether these pit-digging, mud brick, wall-building people come in, let's say, around 1040 or 1030, and are the people who then go on to build what rises above the area of the Citadel Temple on the Citadel of Hazor, which is a fortified city. Here you're looking at an aerial view of the Citadel. That Canaanite palace, the late Bronze Age palace, is down here underneath this, and above it, a large building, a kind of wall that's called a casemate wall. That's a wall that's got chambers on the inside of the wall, so it's a double wall with rooms, and a large gate. Let's look at these elements one by one. We're looking now just at the stuff in green, the 10th century. We'll be moving on to the 9th century next time. So here's area M. And that mud brick wall is right down here, that mud brick wall that I showed you. That mud brick wall goes out of use because this section, only under 40% of the citadel territory, so about 2.5 hectares. It's not nothing, but it's not gigantic. It's just a section, less than half of the citadel, is fortified by a casemate wall, this double wall, and you see a drawing here and you see a view here. And the casemate wall makes a right angle right there. This corner is this corner right here. The casemate wall makes a right angle so that it encloses just this one more defensible point of the upper city. The lower city, it's like you're in the lower city. it keeps on going that way. So yeah, that's just to orient you when you're thinking about those aerial views with the big citadel and then the lower city. It goes like that. The casemate wall is bonded to this large gate. It's a 6-chamber gate. You see it here in the plan and here in aerial view. So this right here is this section. There are two protruding towers to the wall, to the gate, and it makes a very narrow single entry to the fortified citadel. Someplace here I have dimensions. The Hazor gate length, 20.3 meters long and 18 meters wide. 18 meters wide and 20.3 meters long. And the floor of the entryway here, I mean, you can't, it's dug through there, but it was paved with, it was white plastered over a pebble paving. The gate is bonded to the wall, and on the inside of the wall, there is a pebble paving that is bonded at the intersection of the wall and the paving. And that pebble paving is bonded also to the foundation levels of this large building. So this building, this paving, which is something like a street, the casemate wall, and the gate all have to date to the same construction phase. And that construction phase is dated to the 10th century BC on the basis of the domestic pottery, only domestic pottery, that's found inside this building. Cooking pots and store jars and jugs and juglets. And if the Nikon slide scanner in the archaeology lab would have been working this morning, I would have been able to show you a picture of the pottery, but it wasn't, so I couldn't scan it. So I didn't. Yes?
The remnants that were buried in those in the ground, that was also 10th century? The fragments and stuff they found in that?
No, that's Iron 1.
That was Iron 1?
That's 12th, 11th.
Happened before the destruction and then the rebuilding happened.
That's right. That's right. And when I say Iron 1, I mean it's any time in that 200 years, because we can't distinguish earlier and later. It all looks the same for about 200 years. So in the 10th century, here's what we have. Fortified, a small but fortified, mightily fortified citadel, a casemate wall, a monumental gate, and this large building. And you will recall that this is one of the cities mentioned in 1 Kings 9:15, the troika being Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Solomon builds up. So when Yigal Yadin, the monumental titan of Israeli archaeology, who sadly died a number of years ago, came to Hazor in the 1950s to start a monumental project. He came because not only did the biblical account say that this was one of the cities captured and destroyed by Joshua in the Israelite conquest, but that this was one of the cities built up by Solomon. And Yadin has been quoted famously as saying, "I must go to Hazor. I must find out if Joshua was there." There's no destruction at Hazor. Shishak doesn't go there. But the pottery found by Yadin, associated with the wall, the gate, and the building, is identical to the pottery found at another city that is destroyed by Shishak and is also in the list of 3 supposedly built up by Solomon, and that city is Gezer. Hazor is up here. Not only beyond the reach of, or outside the interest of Shishak, but quite a bit far to the north of any evidence for Israelite occupation in Iron 1, in case you're trying to link up these folks with that Iron 1 destruction at Hazor, which you're free to do, and you will not be alone. Many people do it, but I just point out the geographic distance. Gezer is here, on the edge of Philistia, a kind of border site between the Shvela and the true coastal plain. It was Canaanite in the Bronze Age. We can tell by the pottery. It is not a city taken over by the Philistines in the early or the subsequent Philistine expansion. Or that is to say, it's not a city with a majority amount of Philistine bichrome pottery. That is the way that archaeologists decide whether a city fell into the cultural orbit of the Philistines in Iron 2. Gezer was first excavated by a Scottish archaeologist, R.A.S. McAllister, in the very beginning of the 20th century. He went there around 1904. And back then, not so stringent or clear archaeological methodology. It was more like fast, large-scale clearance, and so not so good with the stratified chronology to be able to date the buildings. Kind of messy, the excavations. McAllister and then his successors of McAllister in the middle part of the 20th century opened up various fields and excavated in various places. A huge solid fortification wall was uncovered, and an area right down here with a lot of building, a lot of construction. One of the things that was found by McAllister was a alphabetic text, a document carved in Proto-Canaanite script and wholly legible, read from the right to the left. A small limestone tablet, you could hold it in your hand, about 4 inches by 3 inches, so it's sort of comfortable hand size. Soft limestone, which can be rubbed out and re-incised, and in fact there's evidence on the tablet for that. You can see here some signs that look like they've been essentially erased. So there's a question about whether this is a practice tablet, but it's legible. And it reads, 2 months of harvest, 2 months of planting, 2 months of late planting, a month of hoeing flax, a month of barley harvest, a month of harvest and feasting, 2 months of vine pruning, a month of summer fruit. Abia. Abia is, Abia, it's right there, is his name, the name of the person who wrote it. This is a little bit like a farmer's almanac. It's a little bit like Larry Herr says in the reading that you have, 30 days has September, April, June, and November. It's a kind of agricultural cycle document. So whoever lives here is, the people who live here are literate, and this script is identical to the script on the Isbet Sarta Astrakhan, the ABCD, and is sufficiently, this is not identical to Hebrew, but it's very, very close.
What year was this? 83?
Well, it's dated on the basis of the formations of the letters. So it's dated paleographically, and the letters are a little more like Hebrew, actual Hebrew script, than on the Isbet Sarta Astrakhan. So the alepphs, for example, are more clearly alepphs, and so on. And so it's generally dated to the 10th century BC. So McAllister excavated here, as I said, and he especially excavated a lot down in here, and he identified this mass of rooms as the castle of the Maccabees. We know that the Maccabees, the 2nd century BC Maccabees, it took over Gezer, according to the book of Maccabees. And a lot of material from that period was found in this area, and so McAllister dated this to them. But Yadin, after excavating at Hazor and thinking about 1 Kings 9:15, Solomon builds up Hazor, Gezer, and Megiddo, took another look at this plan of McAllister's and said, hey, look at this. This looks like 1/2 of a gate, just like the gate at Hazor. I bet if you would excavate here, because the levels excavated here by McAllister were higher than this, so this was covering up the other half of this. I bet if you excavate underneath here, you're going to find the other half of a gate from the Iron Age. And sure enough, in the 1970s, American expedition went to Gezer, and that was one of the first things they did, was open up the other half of this area, and they found exactly what Yadin said they would find. They found the rest of a gate, which looks a lot like the gate at Hazor. That gate is the entry area hooked up with a casemate wall, just like at Hazor, to a small fortified compound. The small fortified compound is just one small area of the huge citadel at Gezer. So here's the fortified compound. And you can compare the arrangement, Gezer, Hazor. A smallish fortified area entered by a 6-chambered gate enclosed by a casemate wall. The gate at Gezer, let's see here. The gate at Gezer is 19 meters long and 16.2 meters wide. It's not completely identical. It abuts the casemate wall instead of being bonded with it. It doesn't have clear protruding towers like the Hazor gate. Instead, the front towers are really, in essence, parts of the casemate wall. The measurements are not precise, but they're very, very close. And the linkage of the two is very, very close. And so Yadin was emboldened to say that Solomon, 1 Kings 9:15 is clearly a historical document. Solomon builds up these big cities. And there was even something like a royal architect who planned these fortified enclaves with these gates. So now there's just one missing piece, and the missing piece is Megiddo. So now let's go to Megiddo.
I just had a question. Do they know if these gates, are they, the ribs on these gates, were they like a series of gates that shut it in? Is there anything that, that shows that?
Oh, no, there's
Those used to be connected.
it would have shut at one end and the other, but these are sort of storage rooms or guard rooms. They have benches on the inside. So they're not a whole, it's not like a medieval castle where a whole series of doors come down, boom, 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 one to the other, like, I don't know, get smart. But, so the chambers are, so at Gezer, for example, there were benches on the inside. And they were tall. So these are the cellar portions of the Hazor gate. And there would have been storage up above and so forth. So, 1 Kings 9:15, King Solomon conscripted forced labor to build the temple, the palace, the terraces, that's in Jerusalem, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. All right. So because of the destruction of the small fortress at Gezer, in the latter part of the 10th century. And the appearance of Gezer on Shishak's hieroglyphic list at Karnak, that small fortress with its casemate wall and its six-chambered gate can be dated prior to 925, which puts it in the period of David and Solomon. And because the pottery found in those levels is the same as the pottery found in the large building at Hazor, and the large building at Hazor is linked to the street, to the wall, to the gate, that too can be dated to the 10th century. Megiddo is also on Shishak's list. Megiddo was on everybody's hit list. There's never been a monumental battle over this territory, even World War I, where there's not a battle around Megiddo. Yeah. Okay. Megiddo, stratum 6a, the 11th century stratum, the last remaining Canaanite city inside Israel, not along the coast. That city is destroyed, just like the late Bronze Age city at Hazor was destroyed. Colossally, catastrophically, decisively, finally destroyed. Unlike the earlier destructions at Megiddo, where the city was rebuilt and in essence stayed the same temple, administrative compound, houses, allowing us to believe that the same people continued to live there. After stratum 6a, a whole different sort of architectural layout appears above it. Actually, there is a little stratum there's a sort of ephemeral stratum that appears above stratum 6a, above this colossal destruction. And that's called stratum 5b. And stratum 5b is very, very poor. There are pits. There are sort of shanty houses. It looks something like the Iron One occupation at Hazor. But very soon, stratum 5b is replaced. It is replaced by a big, unfortified city. And this city is destroyed towards the end of the 10th century. And at this site, Megiddo, a fragment of a monumental stele of the pharaoh Shishak was found. So the destruction of this stratum 5a-4b, is associated with the 925 destruction by Shishak, and that means that what's built in that stratum must date to the time of David and Solomon. Okay, that's Shishak. Here we go. What is built there? The city is unfortified, and the structures largely back up against the edges of the mound, and so their back walls comprise the fortified, or the liminal edge of the mound. It's not really fortified. There are houses large and small. The larger ones are called on the plan here Palace, Palace 338, Palace 6000. But only one of these so-called palaces is in and of itself set apart and also fortified, and that's this palace down here, Palace 1723, which we'll get to in a minute. There are also plain houses. Like here, for example, here's a four-room house that looks just like the houses from Ai or Radana from the Iron One. Here are the little columns. There's the long back wall. And there are a number of these sorts of small houses. There's some more over in this area. And inside these houses, little altars are found. Little altars with horns on the corners. Yeah, huh? So we call these horned altars. We call them altars because there's evidence that things were burned on them. So they aren't just very fancy stands. Lindsay? No.
Were those only found in small houses, or were they also found in houses?
They were only found in small houses. No ties to Greece. And Greece at this time is just nothing. This is the Dark Ages in Greece. Nothing's going on there. Well, stuff's going on there, but it's very hard to recover. People are living kind of poor. Okay, so there are houses, and the houses have altars. There is this one kind of large palace. Sadly, only the foundation levels were uncovered, remained to be uncovered by the University of Chicago Oriental Institute excavation team who went here in the 1930s. And here you see an aerial view of Palace 1723. So we don't have any idea what the superstructure is, but it's called a palace with a reasonable amount of legitimacy, or anyway, extra special housing area because it's within a large compound with its own wall and a huge interior courtyard and its own entry gate, this time a 4-chambered gate. And the palace is nice size. It has a big off-center courtyard and rooms around the 2 sides and then another large courtyard over on this side. This style plan, is a North Syrian and Mesopotamian, also Neo-Assyrian, kind of palatial plan. So large administrative buildings, palaces, the palaces at Nineveh, the palace at Nippur, Khorsabad, all the great Neo-Assyrian palaces of the Iron Age are larger versions of, but essentially similar to this kind of layout. This sort of palace plan, this sort of architectural plan, is called a bit halani. Bit is Assyrian for bait, which means house. It's a halani house, Hilani. There's another slightly smaller and not in and of itself fortified so-called palace, Palace 6000. These are the numbers given by the University of Chicago excavators. And you see it here in, again, aerial view and just the foundation levels. Another large open court with rooms, this time around all 4 sides, and a very nice entryway that is not fortified. So there are, and then there's a third extremely large structure here. So there are several much larger buildings. There is, in other words, there's a marked discrepancy between the sizes of domiciles at Megiddo. The problem with this site, okay, so this should be Solomonic because this is the level that's destroyed by Shishak. But as you see, there's no casemate wall and there's no gate. It's unfortified and there's just this simple entryway right here. Now, you also see that due to the nature of the excavation and the remains at the site, the gate area is not directly attached to any other part of the remains from this period. There's no intact architectural link between the area of the gate and anything else. There is a 6-chambered gate at Megiddo. The University of Chicago archaeologists found it. You're looking at it right here. The plan of the gate is very similar to the plans of the gates at Gezer and Hazor. Very similar in measurements, similar in workmanship of stone. 6 chambers, big entryway in the front and the back. But that gate was connected by the original excavators with the level that succeeds the 10th century level. That would be after Solomon, 9th, 8th, iron 2B. At that point, the gate is connected not to a casemate wall, but to a solid wall that encircles the site. Now, as soon as the University of Chicago archaeologists published their findings, they were attacked by other scholars reworking and re-examining the remains. Because there are these large buildings, which we're going to get to next time, when we get to Iron 2B, Megiddo, these large buildings which were identified as stables. Remember Solomon's chariot cities? Remember his chariots? His many, many, many horses? Obviously, according to the biblical text, Solomon needed stables. The stables are linked to the casemate, the solid wall. And the solid wall is linked to the gate. So these archaeologists said, well, the stables must be Solomonic, because Solomon is the person who had the horses. And if the stables are Solomonic, then the gate must be Solomonic. Then there were some excavations in at another site, Samaria, which is the capital of the divided monarchy, again, which we're going to get to. It's a 9th century site. And the workmanship of the stone carving of the stones is, at that site, identical to the way that the gate at Megiddo is carved. So the archaeologists at Samaria said, based on the masonry, the gate has to be 9th century. So, first argument, the gate should be 10th century because it's connected with the stables, which must be 10th century because we know that Solomon had stables. Second argument, the gate has to be 9th century because of the masonry. Yadin, after postulating that there was a gate identical to the one that he'd found at Hazor at Gezer, said, based on 1 Kings 9:15, we just have to put the plans of these gates one right next to another and see that in workmanship and measurement, they are so close that they must date all to the same time, and that time must be Solomon. Lindsay, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm not sure what building she said in the Megiddo for the 9th and 8th centuries.
Uh-huh.
Which during this time, but regardless, is there any place for people to live?
Oh, no, very little. In the 9th and the 8th centuries? No. And we will be getting to the change in Megiddo from the 10th to the 9th centuries. Yeah, there's houses in the 10th century, not in the 9th, 8th. Mm-hmm. Good point. Good observation. So, what actually existed in the 10th century? And how are we to read this statement in 1 Kings 9:15? To answer the question without first using the biblical text as a basis, and recall that so far most of what has happened has been completely animated by an interest in documenting, illustrating, and proving that text. If you just look now without the text at the archaeology, what happened next? This was the 10th century part 1, and the 10th century part 2 we'll do on Tuesday.